I'd like to try and bring the papers together. I'm not sure I'll be able to bring all of them together, but I'll do my best. Um, so I think, interestingly enough, the papers share much in common. This wasn't quite expected. I mean, I had some intimations of this, and the move is basically to say, okay, we know and we're familiar with, and we're not undermining, but we're only setting aside for a minute the important ethical discussion in liberal terms. That is, the autonomy of the hunger striker versus sanctity of life. And we're moving from the liberal ethics, bioethics, to introducing the political question. And so I think this has been common to all four papers to think about hunger strikes as a political question. But I think that in all four papers there's a different notion of the political and a different notion of what hunger strikes is about. And let me put the question in this terms, a little bit challenging the speakers on the normative implications of their talks, although not all the talks were normative in this sense. But let's say that we agree that this is a political question. Then immediately arises the response, so this would be a good reason to quash these hunger strikes, right? I mean, if it's about individual autonomy, then arguments could be made in supporting or respecting the strike. But once we move it into the political field, then there's much more room to suggest that it's a political war, a political struggle, and the state is legitimate in trying to prevent the hunger strikes. Now, I think that in all the papers there was a notion of what exactly stands in opposition to this political will of the state, suggesting that the state needs to nevertheless step back, or at least opening the question of whether the state needs to step back. So not of, in your case, it's I think the question is most pressing. That is, if we move from a liberal to a Republican debate, okay, so now we understand that it's not about individual autonomy, but about a struggle between two republics. I mean, right? So that the Palestinians are trying to push forward, the Palestinian prisoners are trying to push forward a certain kind of collective, you said, political stance, and they're meeting with the political position of the state. So I know that you probably have an answer to this, but this is the question for you. For Itamar, I thought that you weren't making the move from the liberal to the Republican. I thought that there was something else at stake in your discussion of the political. It seems to me that you were trying to map or point to a certain sanctity of the individual that cannot be captured quite clearly within liberal terms. That is, that you were saying, this is the last resort of this individual in this situation. And you were alluding to Hobbes, but you're basically, I think, pointing to a ground zero where the state needs to step back because the individual is undermined, not simply his autonomy, but his very existence in the political. So I wonder about that. And Milko, I think you also want to make the move to the political by hinting to the broader context of the case, the second case that you talk about. But for you, I think the political, at least the way it came out, was the question of justice, right? He's claiming, I am innocent. And somehow this very strong claim for total justice, right? This is totally wrong from the beginning to the end, is a strong move against conditions of imprisonment and for the hunger strike. But then, towards the end of your talk, you said, but this is also because he was Muslim. And this was also because he was a stranger and a foreigner. So this wasn't only about the question of justice. So I want to ask you about this relationship. And Sigal, you promised during your talk that you would say something not just about the move from passivity to agency, but the specific agency of hunger, right? And so I wonder about what that is about. So it's not about death. It's not about necessarily placing your life at the stake, but rather it's about hunger. So I think this differs from at least some of the other papers. So maybe this is too much. Maybe we want to collect more questions.
I think we'll start with these questions because they're very rich, and then we'll move on to other questions. So Itamar?
Sure. Thank you, Shai.
That was very, very interesting and useful. Okay, so first, with regard to the question, I think the general question that you addressed to all of us, does the insertion of the political aspect into this necessarily make it easier to quash hunger strikers? I think I want to disagree with that. I want to my attempt was to show that both the hunger strikes themselves and the government's response to them are kind of necessarily political. They are. It's not that we're moving them into the political realm. It's just that we are admitting and highlighting their political aspects. And what the political question opens is what the political question is what kind of politics do we want? What kind of response do we want to have to these hunger strikers? It's not necessarily clear to me that we want that immediately means that we want the response of quashing them at all costs. It's just a real call to confront that question and give account to it. Now, with regard to the emphasis on the individual that you point to in my paper, I think that's correct. I think there is a certain emphasis on the individual and on a kind of duality of both life and will that constitutes the individual as a political subject within a social contract, within a political community. Having said that, I do want to say that there's also, what also is important to me is emphasis on the perspective of the government itself, the perspective of what it means to have a social contract and to have a political community. And from this perspective, my emphasis was on accountability. That is to say that if indeed what ends up happening is that the government is going to be in the position of leaving the individuals no will for life and a preference to death, it should be accountable to that. It should confront the political ramifications of that and be exposed to that form of critique. That is the kind of political community or political social contract that I think we should be expecting as a minimum, and we should be, it should be necessarily in order to comfortably live with and in politics.
Thank you, Shai. Well, certainly the question that you raised, and it's something that I've tried to address more in depth in the paper. But ultimately, I can say that although the hunger strike might have started, as you said, as a matter of justice from Benghaci's point of view, and this, of course, also I think brings in some other aspects that should be taken into consideration when considering hunger strikers or hunger strikes in a more broad sense. Namely, if we accept them to be politically relevant and acknowledged in these terms, should we then consider that there are different levels of political engagement? And if that is the case, should we, this is just a side question for the discussion, should we behave differently? Because of course, like in the case of Benghaci, he was charged with rape. Now, for the sake of the argument, I will not go into details, and I don't want to question whether he was innocent or not. But let's imagine situations where the crime in question might be more neutral, so to speak. So a robbery, for example. Should we then necessarily have the same behavior towards an hunger striker that is reacting to the prison condition on those bases, contrasting it with, say, Palestinian prisoners? I think there might be some further analysis to do. But going back to the specificity of why did I mention him being a Muslim, foreigner, and so forth, obviously it's related to the biopolitical reading, and I refer to the fact that being external in Foucaultian terms to Italian society as such, also adding on that at the time the government tend to be not particularly friendly towards foreigners for internal reasons, allowed this hunger strike to end in self-starvation and death, in contrast with other cases at the time, like that of Eluana Englaro, which was not an hunger strike, but where the preservation of the sanctity of life was very much cared for in Christian terms. Thank you.
Thank you, Shah. Of course, you touched exactly the most important question, as we already discussed even here in this room, some of those. What we think is actually the Republican understanding is a very important way to bring the notion of the civic action within the political community. And if we understand, and I think it was also presented in some of the other papers, the history of bioethics and how it was developed, so this is exactly how we can move beyond the traditional liberal dilemma and to ask questions of power, and especially when we have a relationship between the individual and the state. And finally, these are issues that we cannot escape. So it's not a matter, I know that you presented it in a provocative way. So of course it's not now a matter of who is right or who is wrong, but understanding or giving the room for this kind of civic action, especially when we have the context of occupation and asymmetric power relations. And especially when we have the prison system with the dual loyalty dilemma as was presented. And what is really amazing, maybe not the good word, but it's happening again and again in many of the ethical discussions that I'm sure you feel the same, how, physicians, and I'm saying it as a physician, or sometimes lawyers, are trying to make a kind of a universal claim and depoliticize, and this is the normal, not normal, but the more traditional way of being done. So yes, there's definitely the idea of, it's not bringing the political, because the political is there, but not denying or being in denial, that by saying that, we are moving to some detached, apolitical sphere, we can escape it. And of course, moving away from the very individualized notion, and also doing some institutional analysis can finally just help to have probably a much more open discussion and political engagement.
So I want to go back to this image, because I think this is the kind of the key moment for the key historical moment to understand how hunger becomes a potent form of political protest. And in a way, my discussion is also about historicizing or kind of deconstructing why is it that hunger strike, the hunger strike came to be the form of protest. Because you can obviously imagine other potential forms of political protest. So why was it that hunger came to be such a profoundly loaded political way of protesting at the time that it has become so? And I think the hunger marches of the early 20th century give exactly the question to this, gives the answer to this question. That one of the titles of one of the first marches that actually came out of Liverpool and never reached London, at the end, the title that they chose for it, "Starved Off by Lack of Funds." And of course, that was the whole point. The whole point was we're hungry and our children are hungry, in a situation that we don't have to be hungry, because it's a matter of governmental management of resources, and there shouldn't be hunger. And there shouldn't be hunger because we're living in an age where hunger shouldn't be an experience kind of that people has to go through. And it's a political issue, and hunger is a political issue. And it was this transition from what Yofi, I didn't send her my notes of how to present me, so there's no context for this discussion. But the context is that I wrote my dissertation, my PhD dissertation about anorexia, and it was a cultural anthropological reading of anorexia in time and in place. And then following that, a few years later, there's a book that it's kind of forthcoming a long time, but it should come out in 2015, and it's about hunger in affluent societies, in which anorexia is a chapter. And anorexia is a chapter, and hunger strikes are a chapter. And the axis, the point, the analytical point of this book is exactly to do this typology of juxtaposing voluntary and non-voluntary hunger, or agentic and autonomous and non-autonomous hunger. So these strikers in this image are exactly about talking about this transformation from non-autonomous hunger of those whose hunger is imposed on them due to poor governmental management of resources, to those who use their hunger. And why is it that hunger has come to be such a profound way of political protest is because hunger has become intolerable culturally at the age of plenty in affluent societies. So there's a historical context to this genealogy of hunger being politicized, but there's also but there are also other layers in that, and one of these layers is that hunger is, I mean, imagine other forms of killing yourself as a protest, which we could have discussed here as well, in a much more fast, brutal, non-negotiable way. People can just go on to the public sphere and just kill themselves. But there's something about the hunger strike that's progressive and that forces the observer to look at the hunger and gives him or her or them a chance to intervene at any point. So I think that hunger strikes are not only about this, they are about this, and they can tragically end with this, but they're much more than they are about this, or much more than it is about this. It's about hunger and the staging of hunger and the responsibility or accountability that's being put on the observer or the person who looks at the hunger being progressed. So I think that's a key point for this typology and for the discussion of hunger.
Thank you. Lena, maybe you should come here and speak from here with the microphone.
Do I have to? Can I just elevate my voice? Does that work?
Well, we're recording, so that's the issue, but maybe we can get the microphone to you. We'll see. Can you pass that down? You can?
How about that?
Maybe people can present themselves as well.
Oh, I'm Lena Saleme. I teach here at the law school. So my question was about the parameters of the ethical discussion that you had this morning. And what I mean by that is that the Palestinian prisoner, who is by definition a political prisoner, his voice is erased in this because we're not talking about his first reason for entering the hunger strike, which is the unethical nature of the imprisonment itself. And so there's a way in which his body becomes the terrain upon which we have an ethical discussion that ignores the first ethical point, much like the occupation is a space where we talk about the laws of occupation without dealing with the first legal question, which is the illegal occupation itself, right? And there's a way in which I found this both common and not surprising, but also quite disturbing, right? Because we have now, again, erased the Palestinian political prisoner, we have now erased the first ethical question, and now are talking about the details of how to deal with his starvation. And where does that other ethical question come in? And how do you have this ethical conversation without avoiding that dilemma?
Okay, I would rather if you were Smada, I think is the natural intimacy.
Should I use the mic also? I'd like to continue the question, but maybe to take it to a slightly different direction. Shai, when you said that, moving it to the political question might imply that the state should step back and just ignore or quash the resistance. But I think it might apply exactly the opposite, that the state should engage politically with the demands that are being put forward by the prisoners. Now, I think that in most cases, when we're talking about hunger strikes of prisoners, the demands are not this general, like to liberate Palestine or to end the imprisonment, the illegal imprisonment of Palestinian prisoners. There are very concrete demands that are far away from these very general political demands that the state actually cannot do a lot with. And if I take as an example the hunger strike that you were talking about in 212, so there were a few demands like stopping solitary confinement of prisoners or renewing family visits from Gaza or other demands that were in fact negotiated by the government, and these things were achieved eventually. So really looking at the question of will you eat or not, will you be force-fed or not, is looking at the body. But if you treat the prisoner as a person, treat the demands and the claims that are made in the concrete and political level, then that is the right way to be talking about those issues.
Just to clarify, though, every one of those political prisoner statements that they make do include discourse discussing the unethical nature of imprisonment. It's not, while they make specific demands, it's always embedded within the discourse that our imprisonment is itself unethical. So that question is never off the table, right? And the question is always about how does the ethics, much like law, become a normalizing discourse in which we suddenly talk about an individual and a state, an individual prisoner, when we're not talking about a prisoner, we're talking about an occupied and an occupier. And that's a completely different framework than talking about an individual prisoner in some other state and in some other context.
And then I'll come around.
I see that there are a lot of questions. I'll try to be quick. One remark about concealing the politics. I think I don't know what is better for the cause, and I don't know if we all agree what's the cause. But we can't conceal the politics anymore. If we talk about what happened here 2 years ago, 1 year ago, on television, people spoke of force-feeding Palestinian prisoners as a Zionist act, and saying that we must force-feed them and there will be medical doctors which will do it as a Zionist act. So after this has been said, it's hard to conceal it. I want to continue what Sigal said about intervention. And I want to suggest that when we repeat those concepts of force feeding or respecting autonomy and saving life, we actually repeat sort of a bioethical straw man, because in practice there's negotiation or there's intervention which is possible. And when we repeat those terms, we forget that it's not either or. It's not either letting the prisoner die and not doing anything or force feeding. So in reality, and I think we don't discuss it enough, because it doesn't fall into this dichotomy which is so easy to discuss in academic terms or in bioethical terms. But we must find other notions to discuss this issue. And I want to end and ask or say something about what the state does. What does it protect? I don't think in any way it really protects life. And this is not only about the Israeli state, because we can see it also in the American case. It saves the life in order to kill the life. And of course, in the case of Israeli prisoners, the moment they're out of jail, the state can kill them without trial, and it does it. So what does the state protect? And I think here we can go back to Agamben and to all this theory. What the state is fighting for is it's protecting its force to make live and let die. What it doesn't allow is the person to decide about its own life, to take its own life. But all the rest is okay. The state can kill you, and it can endanger your life, and it doesn't protect you. It doesn't protect your life. It just won't allow you to take your own life. And that's, I think, very important to remember that, because we can't repeat the idea that the state, is taking care of your life or protecting your life.
Thank you. So we have 3 very related questions. Maybe we'll go a fast round if you want to respond. We'll wait, okay? Next.
Shall I pass or may I?
I think we'll take a round of responses and then...
So can I just, I think it's the last point that you made is, I think the last point that you've made about life being taken or granted by the state is very convincing and very powerful, and it's about feeding and hunger. If we take this to the feeding and hunger, so of course we can talk about analogically take your argument and talk about rate of undernourishment and low-income populations, and there are some discussions on this in Israel, in other places as well, of low-income population who's in a nutritional risk or lack of nutrition, and then what does the government or the public or society at large is committed to do as an interventive mode to prevent these risks, and then what does it do to force feed hunger strikers or anorexics or other protesters. So I think that's a very important point, so that it feeds back to the public responsibility and accountability to make sure that people are not hungry, but to make sure that they are alive or that they're in well-being.
Okay, these are really interesting questions, and I'd like to take them in their order because I think they lead me kind of naturally one to the next. So first, with regard to Lina, I'll just start. In general, I agree with you. In fact, I think what the motivation of my proposal here is exactly to raise those questions rather than push them aside. And if I did indeed push them aside, I think that's really a failure of my own, and I take that as humbly. But I would also like to push back a little bit and just say that you already put the relationships between Palestinians under military control and Israel in terms of occupation, and I think that's a kind of second level category. And what I start from is the reality in which Palestinians are not only treated as enemies, as they surely are in some cases, but also treated through criminal procedure. And in this criminal procedure, they have they perform agency, and this is in the, it could be in the pretrial detention, or it could be in detention not related to a trial, or it could be after indeed being sentenced. But in all these cases, they push the Israeli public and the Israeli government and I guess global observers as well to confront the question of military control over Palestine. And I think that is, if there is a question that needs to be raised and kind of regarded politically, as was the main, I think, motivation of all the papers, that is indeed the main question. I can only agree with that and say that. And now just to Smadar, and Smadar says rightfully that it's not only a question of military control in general, it's also a question of the details of the administration of military control, the details of what happens in prisons, prison conditions, etc. That's all very, very important. And indeed, what I want to point out is a continuum between these two questions. That is to say that they are all related to the same set of governance technologies, you can call it as you will, but even if you're fighting to kind of see your mother or to see your loved one, you are fighting in a way a political fight that is also against the more general framework that is now in place for a long time in the territory of Israel-Palestine. But I think it also Smadal's question also raises the inevitable question: what happens if indeed there is a political prisoner is fighting for a political cause that the bystander that I'm imagining simply does not agree with? Say the prisoner is fighting for the subjugation of women the world over, and they're hunger striking in order to forward that cause, and that cause has no clout whatsoever within the political community that they are living in or outside of it as well. What happens then? And is it then allowed? Are we then allowed to force feed? And I think that's a question we also have to confront. And my answer to that question is no, we're not allowed to force feed even then, but not for ethical reasons, but rather for political reasons. In this case, the government has done all that it thinks it should do, and the community has done all that it thinks that it should do for this person. And if they want to die in order to protest, in order to forward their despicable cause, so be it. Lastly, to Yael, I think, I think you're kind of the more cynical description of the state that you give, following Agamben in part, it may be correct as a kind of descriptive matter, and my intervention here was to try to propose a political theory that is taking as a I actually like Nadav's framing of republicanism, but you can also say popular democracy or a bunch of other terms that relate to the social contract tradition, and think of the state as a framework in which people can both live and sustain themselves and take kind of their own willful political action. So the perspective of the state is a distinctly normative perspective towards the state. I admit that, and if as a descriptive matter things are not the same, doesn't mean that it totally makes the discussion of what we want as a community kind of redundant.
Okay, so why don't we go in the order of who I saw? Yechiel, this gentleman. Chaim, did you want to ask? Did I see your hand? Okay, and Eyal, and then Omri.
Just a word about the Israeli context. It may also apply to others. There are cycles of dehumanization or refusal of basic recognition. Some of the imprisonment are in violation of human rights, the Matzar Minali, the procedural detention. But those detained openly refuse to recognize the legitimacy of the state of Israel as such, which is another cycle of delegitimization and dehumanization. And the real question, I think, and it seems, hearing you here, that this talk about hunger strikes wavers between two conceptions. One, as Clausewitz described war, as politics by other means. And the other is despair, giving up on depolitization, dehumanization, refusal of all cooperation, because war requires cooperation, even in fighting, recognition what victory is, what war is. I don't think dehumanization is something we are going to acknowledge morally as a tract. And if we are talking about engagement in a struggle, every struggle requires its own limit. That's the ABC of the laws of engagement, of laws of armed conflict. And I will talk later on, I think, on the program. I just want to ask you, especially those who oppose any form of force feeding, what kinds of limits should be set on a hunger strike? Like what kind of limits on battles? Because if there are no limits, if indeed there is such a vision that people may autonomously choose to starve themselves or eat feces or bang their heads on the walls, or there's no limit on dehumanizations just because a person does it upon his or herself, it's a very, I find it very portentous to the whole notion of struggle in human society and in history.
Repeat the word, very what? Very
Portentous. Okay. Sorry for my accent.
Maybe we'll pass it along to the
Sorry.
I have simple questions with complicated answers. There is a situation where religious factors, whether you like it or not, are under certain situations. Whether it is a Tunisian in Italy, an Italian in Algiers, or the Palestinian situation. Now, would you say that Palestinians, or Palestinian Arabs to be more precise, were not under occupation under the British, under the Ottomans, under the Jordanians and the Egyptians, and they are for the first time under occupation under Israel? And if you're saying that, does the fact that they were under Muslim rule, did it make any difference And does the occupation become even more important because it's a Jewish occupation over Islam? Hunger is also a religiously defined, in my humble opinion. Men and women are made in the image of God, and both as human beings and as citizens, whether morally or ethically, their obligation is to pay taxes and stay alive. Now, when they don't do that, it is because they're protesting against the rule that they do not approve, whether religious or secular. And what is important is that they are dehumanizing themselves in the name of a greater cause. Misunderstanding between asymmetrical power relations are such that governments try to rehumanize these people by the wrong methods. And the whole complexity is that there is a lack of understanding, ignorance, bias, which, both in ethical and moral and religious terms, have to be handled by innovative approaches, in my humble view. And the problem is that we're all talking of monotheistic religions facing each other like Chinese dragons. What would happen if a British soldier who happened to be Jewish or Christian or Muslim suffered in a Singapore prison or in a Japanese detention camp or in a Burmese situation or in India? Would the same values apply? I am perturbed. Thank you.
Okay, so Omri?
Okay, so I want to apologize in advance for framing my remark in a kind of an economical framework, because this is not the right forum for that, but it could help maybe to clear out some questions. So, so if we're moving from the individual sphere of liberal questions of autonomy and sanctity of life to the more collective Republican question of political protest, we need to ask ourselves whether a hunger strike or any protest is a tool, a bargaining tool. Is it a bargaining tool between a collective and the regime, the government, the political? And if so, we have to ask what are the implications of the rules that we choose that govern this kind of protest on the bargain. So, for example, if we're talking about hunger strikes, we could think of choosing either rule of allowing force feeding or prohibiting force feeding as rules that actually eliminate the bargain, because ex ante both parties, either the government or the hunger strikers, will know what the outcomes would lead to, right? If we allow force feeding, then there is no need to answer to any of the demands of the hunger strikers. If we do not allow force feeding, then it is hard to imagine a government, especially one that is signed on that signs international treaties, to allow the mass death of protesters, which also tells us in advance what the outcomes of the bargain would be. And it also leads to a question: what is a political protest, a collective protest for us? Is it a bargaining tool? Is it a tool to promote a collective freedom of speech? Is it something else? These are all questions that I think are crucial for the understanding of which rules we want to decide on, regardless of the liberal questions of autonomy and sanctity of life. So.
I'm interested what panelist has to say about, in the memorandum of the new bill, of the Israeli force feeding bill, the reasoning was, I was surprised by was that for the first time in force feeding bills around the world, or practices at least, the justification, the reasoning was that it's, for the first time they broke down the usual liberal discussion of the autonomy of the detainee or the inmate, and and the sanctity of life, etc., and said that we are protecting the public interest, saying that is to say that the hunger strike influence third parties as the public, the Palestinian public and the Israeli public, and the public safety is the purpose of the memorandum of the bill that was eventually was not legislated. And I have another second question for Sigal. I know of one case of a suffragist. This is how we say it in English. Suffragist. That was after she went on hunger strike under detention. She was released, and then she suffered from anorexia, and I believe that eventually she died. And I'm wondering whether this case is like your paradigmatic. I don't know. You will. Thank you.
So you have to respond in between because we have to have time. We'll take another round of questions next. Okay. So can you bring back the microphone?
So just briefly, again, I would like to share with you these thoughts that I'm having as a result of some of the comments. And so,
would a Palestinian hunger striking in Israel be considered politically engaged by default in the same protest just by being Palestinian? No matter what the reason why he or she was incarcerated were. In other words, if a person who happened to commit a crime is in the Israeli prison, but is also a Palestinian, Arab Israeli, I don't want to enter into these slightly different definitions. And I think that it's understandable that perhaps, going back to the point you were raising, the state has to somehow defend itself. So if it is engaging into some kind of discussion or bargain, as it was mentioned, it is recognized at some level as an interlocutor, and it can engage in very practical terms, perhaps, in trying to get the prisoner's request, like if I'm not mistaken, perhaps being allowed to see their family more often. But at the same time, by entering that kind of discussion, I think we cannot at the same time delegitimize it fully by saying this entity should not be engaged with. Or we might, but then the hunger strike itself, I think, loses its force. And just a small anecdote in relation to one question that was just mentioned of the suffragette and the moving into the anorexia. Up until recently, it was very common that, well, it was very high in percentage that anorexics who were force-fed against their wills eventually ended up suiciding afterwards. So this was quite a scandal. And to conclude, you referred that UK has been having a particular relationship with this. In 2012, there was this case of
a 32-year-old
established a precedent that certainly should be looked into more. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to first respond or just talk about what Omri said with regard to the bargaining tool. I think that's an extremely useful way of describing exactly what I personally tried to highlight in my talk, and that's really wonderful. I agree, as you say, that perceiving this as a bargaining tool asks us what rules we want to choose. And so I think we have two kind of resources that are readily available, maybe more, but that I can think of now. So first we can think of comparing the United States and Europe. The United States, force feeding is allowed not only, as I said, in Guantanamo Bay, but also in their domestic prisons. And we also know that in the United States there's an extremely high rate of incarceration. We also know that black males are overrepresented in prisons. We know many facts about what who is hunger striking in those prisons, and what are the results? And we also know that European countries have by and large not chosen that option, and they have a lower incarceration rates. They have, and many of these problems that exist in the American system do not exist in the European context. So I think part of what we're asking is what we want to be more like. What kind of, what are the, probable results of adopting this particular rule or that particular rule with regard to these bargaining rules, and what is the result in terms of the political making of a society? So that's very useful in showing that. And I think another obvious parallel is to the strike in the context of labor terms. So with that, I'll just move on, and I want to also respond to Yechiel. I'm not sure that I understood exactly why you think that no limits are a pretentious option. So I just don't know what to do with that, because I don't understand why you're saying that. But with regard to the idea that hunger strikes are politics and other means, the Clausewitzian idea that you raised, I think that's it's also kind of useful to take that into account. We can think of politics kind of traditionally, or kind of in a particular vision of politics, as first and foremost a form of discourse. And we can also think and if violence is a form of politics and other means is a question, and if you answer no to that, you can still have the question, what happens in the kind of in-between level, where you're not in the context of discourse and you're not in the context of violence. So this pertains to forms of civil disobedience, it pertains to hunger strikes, it pertains to a lot of ways in which you can reject or resist a particular form of governance. And I think you should ask yourself, is that more similar to violence, or is it more similar to discourse? And I think it's more similar to discourse, and therefore I think it's politics per se. But that can be argued. Okay, I think I want to skip the other questions. Yeah.
We're doing fine. I said we have a lot of time, but it's shrinking.
So maybe just starting with a question about religion, but not exactly in the form that you phrased it, kind of tapping into it from another perspective. If religion is about an ethical or a moral engagement in the world, and I'm not going into the political kind of categorization of monotheistic and non-monotheistic and then the subtypes of it, I'm just kind of zooming out. If religion is about a moral being in the world, so obviously there is something very potent and important to learn from hunger strikes and from the politics of hunger strikes about religions and with religion. Because as opposed to, that's my opinion, that as opposed to the way you framed it, that the hunger striker is actually dehumanizing himself or herself, and the intervention is actually a humanizing action, I would say the exact opposite. The protester is saying, by staging hunger, by staging suffering, what is actually being staged out and what is actually being performed is, I am human because I am suffering, and it is the suffering that makes me human. Look at me, I'm human, and it is my suffering that makes me human, and it is your humanity that forces you to look at me as human and makes you responsible or accountable for my own suffering. And that's a communicative aspect of hunger strikes and of anorexia and of other forms of, which is very different from, again, we could have thought of other ways of killing yourself in public as a way of protest, and these have been done as well. But there's something specific about hunger strikes, and that's a progressive spectacle of suffering that's being imposed on the spectator. And it's exactly this communicative act, and what is being communicated is the suffering that I think transforms us into a religious realm in a different way, not in the way you've described it. So I think religion and moral subjectivity in hunger and in hunger strike is in hunger strikes and in an anorexic hunger, moral subjectivity is very potent. The suffragists were explicitly saying that what they are doing is that they're willing to make themselves victims and to make their victimhood public and to make their victimhood shown, and they show and they conceived of themselves as victims, not as protesters by displaying victimhood. And the display of victimhood is the core of a hunger strike. So it is exactly about humanizing through the spectacle of hunger. That's important, I think, to bear in mind. And about these kind of transitions from the suffragists to the anorexics to the hunger strikers that came across two of these comments, I think, yes, it's very much to the point. That's exactly the point, and it's also something that Yael mentioned before, that we may do better by kind of putting aside these dichotomies. It's not about dying and living, it's about starving and progressively starving, which is a different way of framing the debate, and I think it's important to bear that in mind. And just a last word, I think, kind of trying to figure out what I make of these comments that came across here. In this typology of trying to figure out the relations between anorexia and hunger strikes, it occurs to me that we might have found ourselves in a less tense or less ambivalent discussion if we would have framed hunger strikes as a form of self-harm. And then the question would have been self-harm. And then the question would have been, are we, from which point or from which perspective are we comfortable about taking kind of legitimizing self-harm as a form of being in this world. And self-harm, there are self-harm groups that are doing, teaching each other how to commit suicide or self-mutilate or self-cut and other forms of collective self-harms. And anorexia, and especially in the age of internet and pro-ana communities, is being framed as self-harm. And I think we could add this or take this on to the discussion, again, to come out of the life and death questions to the question of self-harm, and again to elaborate and go back into these moral questions of religion.
Sorry, we have.
I totally agree with you, Sigal, about this humanizing aspect, and I think that maybe at least with some of the question, I think part of the problem is how we are framing the discussion, and from my perspective, or for our perspective, bringing this Republican notion is being very sensitive to the institutional context, to the historical context. So this is why I don't exactly understand. You're absolutely right. I mean, we can have the same discussion during the British Mandate. I don't see what is the problem here, or I don't know, or in Dublin during the Irish-British. And it also answers, I think, your question. I know that in certain kind of discussion of bioethics, you want to go to the limits sometime, to make it dichotomy. At least in our discussion, this is less of our focus. Not that it's not important, but you can see, and this is what we try to show, and it's also for your question about the memorandum, how a certain kind of framing the discussion in the traditional bioethical forms are depoliticizing and going back again to those questions and maybe dehumanizing in a way those who are doing the hunger strike. So I think it's one of the main questions here is exactly how you frame as a question, and we try to frame it in a different way. And there are practical consequences, for example, about things that probably we'll have in the later discussion about the prison healthcare system, about question about dual loyalty, about the memorandum, things that with the traditional bioethical tools usually are left outside of the discussion.
So maybe I'll conclude with a comment, less than a question. When you talked, Sigal, and this pertains to all the paper, but when you talked about the absurdity of people going hungry in the streets and dying there and the government won't interfere, but when they start hunger striking or not feeding themselves, that's where we care as a public. It brought to mind for me duality or parallel duality that exists in the politics of refugee law. So the Refugee Convention actually says that, and this is not direct, it's a very gross description, that if you are a political activist that is persecuted in your own country, we'll give you a status of a refugee, whereas if you're just starving like anybody else, we won't interfere. So it's kind of taking it the other way around. And then my final point is, you talked, Sigal, about autonomous despair, and I think I suggest that the better term would be desperate autonomy. Because autonomous despair, the despair here is passive and it's emotional, whereas desperate autonomy means, I think that desperate here immediately becomes political. So thank you very much for a rich and an exciting session.